us now move to two scholars. First, Professor Galia Golan from the Department of Political Science here at the Hebrew University. Professor Golan was also behind the scenes of the conference, and she has also a story to tell us. Thank you, Galia.
There are lots of speeches here. Well, we've heard quite a bit from the inside about Madrid, and my approach is, of course, much more academic. Madrid itself was born of an agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, Saddam Hussein said that he would take his forces out of Kuwait when Israel removed itself from the occupied territories. And now the United States wasn't particularly happy with that kind of linkage. And so what they agreed, what the Americans agreed at the time, was that after the Iraq crisis and Kuwait and so forth, then the United States would be willing to promote a discussion about the Arab-Israeli or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's what was agreed between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviets were a little worried too, because they had a friendship treaty with Iraq. But then the trouble came. You've heard a little bit about it already. Secretary of State Baker had to bring the two sides, Israel and the Palestinians, to some table. And the Madrid conference was, in fact, the proposed solution, hopefully, to this kind of linkage that Saddam Hussein had made. Well, truthfully, and as I say, I think you've heard some of it already, this was not an easy feat for Baker, as he tried to persuade both Israel and the Palestinians to meet. And I think both countries were ambivalent, let's put it that way. For Israel, the positive aspect of Madrid was that for the first time, Israel would be sitting with all of the Arab states with which we had been at war, because as you've already heard in Geneva, the Syrians weren't officially present. On the other hand, this wasn't exactly what the Israelis wanted. Traditionally, Israel preferred bilateral talks rather than be faced with this sort of wall of Arab states and having to deal with them all at one time. So there was a certain ambivalence from that point of view. It was good on the one hand to have all the Arab states there. On the other hand, Israel certainly had preferred bilateral conversations in the past. The second problem, of course, for Israel was who was the other side going to be. The Shamir was not interested in speaking with the PLO, and as has been pointed out, neither were the labor governments before that. And that was made very clear. For the Palestinians, I think there was also a great deal of ambivalence, because on the one hand, the conference would provide them with a certain amount of publicity to bring their issue once again to the international arena and to the public, and that was a positive aspect. But of course, there was the issue of who would represent the Palestinians, and for them, it could only be the PLO, which, by the way, we're talking 1991. 1988, the PLO had already accepted the two-state solution, accepted Resolution 242, and agreed to a peace, to try to enter into a peace agreement with Israel. But for the Palestinians, the important thing was that they would be represented by the PLO. And so Baker had to juggle these things. The answer that Baker gave to Israel was, number one, he promised there would be no surprises, and he came up with the idea of a joint PLO-Jordanian delegation, with the PLO people being more or less local. At the time, I was in the leadership of Peace Now, we met many times with the Palestinians to try to persuade them to accept this. We met at Faisal Husseini's house in East Jerusalem, and basically what we said, I'm not sure that we were the important factor here, but basically what we said is, okay, you'll go in a joint delegation, and the PLO will be in the next room, and you'll communicate, which is basically what happened, of course. They went, and they were in constant contact with the PLO, mainly telephoning to Tunis. But they went, and that was the important thing. We've heard about Shamir and why he went. I didn't know Shamir, and I don't know why he went. I can only say as an academic, I know that he said later that he intended to drag things out. Whether that was what was in his mind or not, I have no way of knowing, obviously. There were, of course, results. Madrid, like the original Geneva conference after the Yom Kippur War, broke into bilateral talks and multilateral talks. And the multilateral talks actually got somewhere. Multilateral talks where Europeans participated as well. They had one group for environment, one group for refugees, one group for arms control, another group, I believe, for water. The arms control multilateral group actually made a good deal of progress. I think it's the only one we can say made progress, but they did move, and they did move fairly nicely. The bilateral talks, which took place in Washington, didn't go well, and that's, of course, how we got to Oslo. They weren't making much progress in the bilaterals in Washington, and so this back channel began, as you know, that ultimately led us to Oslo. I just want to say one last thing, and that's about the speech that Abdel Shafi gave at Madrid. And I reread it in preparation for this conference, and I really recommend reading it. It's really quite extraordinary. Personally, I think that it was written by Hanan Ashrawi, but that's never been proven as far as I know, and I haven't asked her. But the speech is really incredible. And I know at the time when I heard the speech, I thought, this speech is written by somebody who knows what Israelis need to hear, what our red lines are, and how we might go forward. It's really quite extraordinary. Of course, this is after 1988, when the PLO had already talked about two states, and so the speech, of course, talks about two states. It talks a great deal about peace. It also presents the Palestinian grievances, talks about the occupation, the settlements. It's a very strong speech from that point of view, but it also recalled the peace camp in Israel, the thing that we had organized as Hands Around Jerusalem, of Jews and Palestinians together. Also, the speech talked about refugees and talked about Resolution 194, which is not something Israel wanted to hear. But it talked about the deportees of 1967. Not a word about 1948. Now that's, to anybody analyzing these things, is very significant. Not because they did not, it's not because they didn't have grievances about 1948, but they knew that in going forward with Israel, to start talking about 1948, which questioned the very founding of the State of Israel, is not going to get them very far. Israel preferred to begin with 1967. And that's where they began in the speech. They talked about peace, they talked about two states, and they mentioned the sad history, the sad past of Israel. And again, this was another one of these things where I'd heard the PLO people and Palestinians talk about comparing Israel to Nazi Germany and the way we conducted the occupation. And they knew that this was a red line for us. And so they didn't. In this speech, Abdel Shafi talked about the sad past of Israel, which was the same way of referring to the past in a way that was possible for Israelis to hear. All I really want to say by this, and I really recommend reading this speech because it's quite extraordinary, but I also draw from this, I think, the role of civil society. Now, I'm not a politician, and although I'm in Meretz, I never took a decision to go into formal politics. I'm not a diplomat. But I have been very active in civil society, and I felt very strongly as I listened to the speeches during Madrid that civil society had a role to play, and I think civil society still has a role to play, and it's in this communication. I know that we learned from the Palestinians. We learned what the past meant to them. We knew what they wanted. And they learned from us. And I think that that's one of the crucial things that came out of this for me. And that is the role of civil society and this role of communications between enemies. And I think that this is one of the lessons from Madrid. Because when the delegations went to Madrid, they were very well prepared. They were very well prepared, and I think they understood the other side a lot better than maybe we do even today. And I mean this both ways, as bilateral. I think that this was much of the importance of Madrid. Of course, it was a breakthrough. It was a breakthrough that ultimately led to Oslo, and ultimately, of course, a peace agreement with Jordan. But I think, for me in any case, what was most important about this was this finally coming together, finally seeing the other side in a mutual way. And I think that's what made it such a constructive exercise. Thank you.